Finally, I get to use a real piece of wood. I've chosen a nice straight 2x12 that's relatively free of knots. This is a piece of Doug fir, which is one of the strongest framing lumbers we have available locally. Another reason for using a 2x12 is so that I can keep at least 3.5 inches between the point of our notch and the edge of our board. I've set these stair buttons for our calculated rise and run. These stair buttons are great because they'll keep all the triangles the same as I move down the board. If you don't have a set of stair buttons, you can use a 1x4 clamped to the back of your framing square, and that'll work just as well. Since our framing lumber has rounded edges, it's important that these lines intersect the correct point on our framing square, because even a 32nd of an inch error in each notch could equal a ½ inch error in the overall length. Now I'll lay out the rest of my notches. Before I show you how to mark the bottom and top of the carriage, let me show you a method that will reassure you that your layout has come out at the right length at the bottom. This method will also help you determine the length of lumber you'll need when buying your carriage material. Remember the old Pythagorean theorem? A squared plus B squared equals C squared. A is our total rise measured from finished floor to finished floor. B is the total run. That's just the sum of our individual runs of our treads. C is the hypotenuse. This length will give us a way to check our layout from this point to this point. Knowing this length, I can buy my carriage lumber. I always like to buy a foot or so extra on each end in case I have to cut off any splits. Also knowing this length gives me another method for laying out my carriage. I can take this number, divide by 14, the number of my triangles, transfer that length to a pair of dividers, and lay out on the edge of my real 2x12 these points where the triangles intersect the edge of the board. You may have to adjust this dimension a couple times so that you come out at the right spot at the very end. Then I go back with my framing square and draw my lines through those points. This is the top of my carriage, and I've just drawn in the line that represents the finished floor and the line that represents where the carriage will butt into the header. I need to subtract 3/4 of an inch for a hanger board, which will be the means of attaching our carriage to the header. Don't worry, I'll tell you more about the carriage board in a minute. Now I've got my saw lines marked at the top, and I can go finish laying out the bottom. This line I'm going to draw represents my finished floor. And this is an area where people commonly have a problem, and I certainly have had a few too, in that they don't do what is called dropping the carriage. This is a piece of plywood that's the same thickness as I'm going to use for my treads, 1 1/8 inches. You can see when I position this, as if it were a real tread, that the distance from our finished floor line to the top of our tread is greater than our calculated rise. To solve this, I'm going to shorten the height of the first riser by removing the thickness of this tread from the bottom of the carriage. This is now our new finished floor line. And now our bottom riser is the correct height. Dropping the carriage also lowers the top to the correct position. One more thing. I like to anchor my carriages to the subfloor. This line represents our finished floor line and is our cut line since we're using carpet on our stairway. If we had planned on using 3/4 inch oak flooring and had adjusted for this in our total rise calculations, I would want to add the thickness of this flooring to the bottom of my carriage. And this new line would represent our subfloor. I'm using a Skill worm drive saw, which is the same saw used for all my framing. Only here I've put on a 40-tooth carbide blade to get a smooth cut. The first cut I make is for the top tread. And this cut is for where the hanger board attaches to the carriage. You can see I have to hold up the guard with my thumb because the saw is coming at an angle to the board. Don't be tempted to wedge up the guard, because if the saw kicks back you might get cut. This is the cut for the top riser, well on the waist side of the line. And here's the cut for the top tread, also on the waist side of the line. Don't be tempted to let these cuts overlap, as I've seen some carpenters do. They want that chunk to drop out without using a handsaw, but it weakens the carriage. Let me show you what this looks like on the back side. When I'm making my cuts with a handsaw, I want to be sure not to go any further than the imaginary lines. After I finish cutting out the rest of these notches, I use this carriage as a pattern for our other two.